This contracts problem focuses our attention on the UCC in complicated and interesting ways. You'll see the issues presented on this hypothetical both on the multi-state and on various essay questions, both in practice and very likely on the exam itself. Take a look at the call of the question. It reads, "What rights and remedies does Neptune have against SUP? What damages, if any, might Neptune recover? And what defenses, if any, should SUP assert? Discuss." So we've got a pretty standard call of the question. We're dealing with civil litigants. We know that the plaintiff, Neptune, is going to have one or more theories of liability. We also know that the plaintiff is going to have a prayer for relief that focuses on damages. We know that damages, in the broadest sense, consist of compensatory and punitive damages. So, with all of that in mind, we go to the top of the question, and it doesn't take very long for us to tell that this is a UCC problem involving merchants. So right up front, we know that contract formation is going to be easier, and we know that the preferred remedy is going to be damages. In paragraph 1, we meet our plaintiff, Neptune. They are a seafood restaurant that specializes in salmon, and perhaps the key fact from the first paragraph is that this restaurant has only been open for 6 months. And this is a very standard fact that you will see on multi-state questions and on essays. Whenever we've got a business that is a plaintiff that only has been open for a short time, damages may well be speculative because businesses that are startups are notorious for failing. So, with all that in mind, we go to paragraph 2. In paragraph 2, we get a key fact, which is that the underlying agreement between these two parties is valid. This is not a question that's dealing with formation issues, and therefore, as a process of elimination, this is going to be a problem that focuses our attention on breach and on remedies, in particular, damages. So look carefully at the contract at issue. It's a contract between two UCC merchants, Neptune and SUP. The contract calls for the defendant to supply the plaintiff with 250 pounds of salmon per week at the price of $4 per pound for 1 year. The contract makes sense, and we're told it's valid. So one good way to lose a lot of points on this question would be to write a bunch of stuff in your answer about formation or defenses to formation. The contract's valid. There are no issues with regard to formation. Now, in paragraph 3, we get the complicated facts that make this such an interesting and also a difficult question. We find out about the oil spill. And the things that come to mind with regard to an oil spill in a transaction involving the sale of fish are issues of impossibility or commercial impracticability. But look very carefully at the facts. In particular, look at the last couple of lines. We see that the defendant is harvesting more than 450 pounds of salmon per week, even after the spill. And we know that the defendant's obligations to the plaintiff under the contract only go so far as 250 pounds of fish. So we can decide right now that the defendant will not have a successful impossibility defense. Why? Because the facts tell us that the defendant is harvesting more than enough salmon to meet the plaintiff's needs. With regard to commercial impracticability, what we are looking for are specific details about the increased costs of fishing. And we don't get any of those facts. So although we can assume that the defendant will be raising a commercial impracticability defense to breach, there aren't really any facts that support it. We can infer the likelihood of higher costs, but so far we don't know anything about them. Now, go to paragraph 4, and here we see facts that will make our damages discussion more complicated. We know that the UCC prefers damages. Damages are easily quantifiable, and that's what we're expecting under the UCC. And we see that the plaintiff here does partially cover the contract that has gone astray with the seller of SUP. But look at the end of the paragraph. Here we've got a plaintiff who chooses to make menu changes rather than try to compete for salmon on the open market. And that is not an unreasonable decision. However, it is a decision that we're not going to incur further liability to the defendant for. The defendant didn't make this decision. The plaintiff did. And the plaintiff has got an obligation to mitigate damages, and under the UCC, we prefer for damages to be the remedy. Now, look at the next paragraph. We see a short little 3-line paragraph that discusses consequential damages. Regular compensatory damages just flow from the breach, but consequential damages happen as a consequence of the breach, as opposed to being just the cover remedy. Both a cover remedy and consequential damages fall under the umbrella of compensatory damages. With regard to consequential damages, the rule is that these damages need to be foreseeable to the defendant at the time that the contract is formed. And at the time this contract was formed, the defendant seller could assume that in the event of a breakdown in their relationship, that the plaintiff would go cover and get salmon on the open market and maybe sue for the difference in price. Then we get the next to the last paragraph. Neptune is still concerned about acquiring salmon. They've still got these problems. And then we get the call of the question. This is a complicated question, and it's a difficult one to answer under time constraints. As we get into it, we'll see that the issues presented aren't really that difficult, but organizing this answer is. So turn the page, take a look at the outline of issues that I've presented. You'll see that what I present is pretty much responsive to the call of the question. I discuss Neptune's rights, because the call of the question requires us to focus on the theory of liability a little bit. We know the contract's valid, so you don't see any room in my outline for a discussion of validity. I just go with what the question told us. The contract's valid. It's a UCC agreement among merchants, and there is an apparent breach by SUP at the time that SUP communicated its unwillingness to perform under the original contract price. So next, we focus on remedies, and the principal remedy that we're directed to focus on is damages. The expectation damages that the plaintiff would seek would be getting the salmon at the right price. So the cover remedy is appropriate under the UCC, and to the extent the plaintiff can prove a breach by the defendant, the plaintiff's entitled to a dollar-for-dollar recovery of any out-of-pocket expenses that go beyond $4 a pound. Next, we focus on consequential damages, and you'll see here that I break it down into the two categories of damages, consequential damages, that the fact pattern gives us. I talk about the 25% decline in restaurant business, and I discuss the 75% decline in the bookings for catering jobs. Now, we have to acknowledge that this is a startup restaurant. It might have failed anyway, but the fact that the defendant has breached the key product that the plaintiff sells is enough, I think, that at least to some extent, the consequential damages are something the plaintiff has got a prayer for. Ultimately, personally, I would hold the defendant responsible for losses caused by changing the menu. I would hold those to be unforeseeable to the defendant at the time that the contract was formed. But I grant that a reasonably persuasive argument can be made on the other side as well. And you'll see plenty of multi-state questions framed along similar lines where you've got to make a judgment call. One could imagine a well-written multi-state question that could direct us to reach either conclusion based on how the picks were framed. We know that the plaintiff has got a duty to mitigate, and it seems to me that with regard to a UCC transaction where a plaintiff fails to cover, that failure to cover could be considered a failure to mitigate damages. Here again, arguments can be made on both sides. I suggest that the argument that I've presented is probably the more mainstream argument, but the way people failed this question when it actually appeared on a bar exam was by leaving material out, not by reaching the wrong conclusions. Finally, I would consider specific performance briefly in a discussion here, even though the call of the question is really focusing our attention on damages. And the reason I would discuss specific performance at all is because it's a preferred remedy for this plaintiff. It's not a preferred remedy under the UCC, damages is. But under these facts, we see that a good that typically is fungible, salmon, is now subject to a severe shortage on the market as a result of this oil spill. Now, the problem that the plaintiff has is the greater the hardship on the market caused by the oil spill, the less likely the plaintiff will be able to be entitled to equitable relief. Why? Because it wouldn't be fair. Now, we turn to SUP's defenses. And before we touch on them substantively, let me acknowledge, just from an organizational perspective, it would have been easy to weave the defenses into an analysis of the other issues. And by and large, that would be a welcome approach. And it's one that I personally follow from time to time. But for the purposes of this hypothetical, since the call of the question did segregate the defenses in a separate clause of the question, I am separating them in a separate section of the answer. Now, you might expect, based on the approach that I have presented to contracts, that I would start out with defenses to formation, because we know that a defendant in a contracts case can impose defenses to formation, to breach, and to remedies. But we're told that this contract is valid. So I don't waste time discussing defenses to formation that I know will fail. I turn to defenses to breach, and here we've got plenty of stuff to discuss. We know that the defendant would be arguing along the lines of impossibility, commercial impracticability, perhaps frustration of purpose. But we know that this contract is not impossible for the defendant to perform. Why? Because the facts tell us as much. The facts indicate that this defendant is harvesting 450 pounds of salmon a week. We know that the defendant's obligations to the plaintiff under the contract are for 250 pounds of salmon per week. So, with regard to commercial impracticability, the problem that we have in terms of representing this defendant is there aren't any facts that specifically tell us that the costs are that much higher for the defendant. To the extent they are a lot higher as a result of this oil spill, that would be a defense to breach, and it would be a justification for the defendant offering to perform at a higher price. Now, it seems to me that the absence of those specific facts is reason enough that probably the plaintiff has got the stronger argument here. The fact that the defendant is missing out on a possible windfall profit, taking advantage of their sudden big advantage in the marketplace, is not the same thing as commercial impracticability. If the defendant is still going to make a reasonable profit, the fact that they're not going to get a windfall doesn't excuse their performance under a contract that seems a little more burdensome than it did at the time that it was formed. So, ultimately, I would argue that the plaintiff is going to be entitled to obtain a damages award, particularly to the extent that the plaintiff is alleging a cover damage. With regard to the consequential damages, here I think the plaintiff is on much less certain ground. And personally, I would be inclined to find narrowly in favor of the defendant. And to the extent that there are facts that we don't know about that would strengthen a commercial impracticability defense to breach, under those circumstances, the damages remedy might be a little bit more difficult for the plaintiff to obtain as well. And that wraps up a discussion of what I think you will agree is a complicated, tricky UCC problem focusing on breach and remedies as opposed to focusing on formation.